Welcome to this short demonstration of looking at housing data in Acumen's Alpha Vision software. Today we'll be looking at a data set from data.gov, specifically housing problems of low-income households. First, I've opened this data set in Excel, and notice what we have here is information organized county by county across the United States. And I'll scroll down. We see we have about 1,800 lines representing 50 states plus District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. We have information about total number of low-income households and also the portion of those households reporting problems of any type, then specifically the portion reporting substandard units, and where overcrowding is the worst problem and where cost burden is the worst problem. And as I scroll over, we'll see we've got quite a number of columns worth of data here. A lot of numbers. Let's look at this now in Acumen's Alpha Vision. And here I've converted those numbers to a visual landscape. And let me go through what we're looking at and how I've drawn this picture. First, notice we have a lot of essentially look like buildings. And these buildings are organized onto plates. And you'll notice from these labels, the plates are representing states. So for instance, all these buildings belong to Kansas, and the buildings themselves are representing the counties. So if I click on one here, we see Sedgwick County, Kansas, Johnson County, Kansas, and so on and so forth. First thing you might notice is that the footprint size of these buildings is not all the same. For instance, Sedgwick County is quite large relative to, in the upper right here, Seward County in Kansas. The reason why is in this particular case, for this data sample, I said to size those buildings and also organize them based upon the total number of low-income households. So counties like Sedgwick and Johnson get larger footprints because they have a larger number of low-income households, and counties like Seward get a small footprint because they have a smaller number of low-income households. You'll also, of course, notice they're not all the same color. In this example, what I've done is I've said dark green buildings should represent a lower portion or a relatively lower portion of housing problems being reported. And that's going to progress through white, and white buildings are going to be kind of around average, to red, where a larger number of problems are being reported. So if we see a dark red building, like right here, Douglas County, we know right away that tells us that a larger proportion of households is reporting some type of problem. Low-income households are reporting some type of problem. And these greener, or white, let's look at a white building here like Howley County, more average amount. And as we get darker and darker green, it's lower and lower portion of problems being reported. So let's zoom out and look at the entire United States here. And first thing, of course, we can notice just by color alone is that in most states, most counties are reporting a relatively large number or large portion of low-income households reporting some type of problem. We see some clear outliers, and let's look at those briefly. Even before we look at an outlier, we'll look at one that certainly follows that trend. For instance, California and New York. We see almost all the counties reporting a relatively large number of some type of problem. We see, for instance, one outlier here, Calaveras County, California. You see a little bit green there, but pretty much red across the state. We see a slightly different trend in Virginia, where the large, and we know that because of the larger footprints and kind of in the bottom left area, the large counties tend to be reporting a lot of problems, and then the smaller counties, with some definite outliers here, but for the most part, the smaller counties reporting less problems. We see the same general trend going on in Tennessee. We see that repeated in a number of states where it seems to be the large counties reporting a lot of problems and the smaller ones reporting less. Though, like I said, it's not an absolute trend by any means, because we definitely have these red buildings we can pick out, like Granville County, North Carolina, where even though it's a smaller county, they're reporting, in this case, 76% of households. We see that in this heads-up display kind of in the upper right-hand corner here. 76% of households reporting some type of problem. Some obvious outliers as entire states, West Virginia, of course, a lot of green, and interesting, Puerto Rico, with a few exceptions, mostly a lot of dark green. So Puerto Rico is an area where clearly we'd expect to see some cost burden problems. At least that would be my thought going into this. However, we see that the overall portion of problems being reported is lower than most of the rest of the United States, with a few exceptions, of course. So now let's try to dig in a little deeper and see what's actually causing these problems. What is at the root of these problems being reported? Let's first look at where substandard units are being reported. And I'm going to click on this view over here in my view library. It says percent substandard unit. And we've redrawn our landscape. Notice I'm organized the same way still. We're still block by block is showing us various states. Each building is showing us a county. But now, short green buildings is where there's a low percentage of substandard units, and tall red buildings is telling you where there's a lot or a high percentage of substandard units. So we can see immediately that in most states across the country, substandard housing is not the primary problem. And we have our obvious outliers. For instance, we can see right away in Indiana, where it's mostly short red buildings. We have Adams County, Indiana, with over 15% of the units. And again, we're looking at our upper right-hand area here in our heads-up display. Over 15% of the housing units reporting substandard units. So clearly, if there's maintenance money going in Indiana, Adams County might be a good target for that money. Arizona, again, some of the smaller counties in Arizona. And we see that in a few states. That in a lot of states there tend to be one or two major outliers. And then, of course, our one major outlier as, well, not a state, but Puerto Rico. Of course, across Puerto Rico, a lot of the counties, it looks like at least half of the counties have tall, dark red buildings here, telling us that substandard units is a problem across most areas of Puerto Rico. And we can start looking around in here. But see, it's not just a large or just a small. It tends to be a broad swash of Puerto Rico, where we have a substandard unit problem. Let's look at a slightly different example now, or a different problem, where overcrowding is being reported as the worst problem. And I'm going to click here where it says percent with overcrowding and no worst problem. And now, again, our initial take when looking at the entire United States or entire country is that overcrowding is not repeated across all states. However, it does tend to be concentrated in some pretty key areas. California, certainly. Almost all areas, all counties of California tend to have overcrowding as a pretty major problem. New York, large areas of New York, Kings County, Bronx County, Queens County, to a slightly lesser extent New York County, tend to have overcrowding as a serious problem. It looks like the smaller counties in New York, for the most part, small and medium, is not as much of a problem, but the key exception here being Rockland County, New York. Same kind of general trend across Texas, to where we see a large county in Texas, Harris County, having overcrowding as a serious problem. But again, the more medium-sized and smaller counties, more exceptions here, but mostly overcrowding not being as serious of a problem in Texas. Let's look back at Puerto Rico, since that's an area where we had a problem before. And again, more concentrated in the smaller counties. It's not as obviously of a widespread problem as, say, substandard housing units were, but clearly overcrowding is a problem in a number of areas in Puerto Rico. And of course, we could repeat this analysis across other states and districts and areas in the United States. Hawaii, obviously overcrowding a problem there. Let's now look at where cost burden is being reported as a primary problem. And I'm going to click on this link here, link in our view library for percent with cost burden and no worst problem. And here we see a very different story. Immediately, we can tell cost burden is being reported in most counties across the United States. Almost every state area across the United States is reporting a large portion of low-income households reporting cost burden as a problem. And that makes sense, right? We're looking at low-income households. We would expect cost burden to be a potential problem. Interestingly, is we have one very stark outlier. And again, we're back to Puerto Rico. Once again, bucking the trend of most of the rest of the United States, where no county in Puerto Rico is reporting a large portion of low-income households reporting cost burden as the most serious problem. And I'm not certain exactly why that is. I could conjecture that overcrowding and substandard units are enough of a problem there that cost is no longer the major problem. Maybe the housing is less expensive there. That would be for the analysts to dig into. But what we see is that what needs to be addressed in Puerto Rico is the substandard need and overcrowding problem, not so much the cost burden problem. Okay, well, we've taken a very quick look at television and not gone into a lot of great detail of all the functionality, but given a quick overview of how we can convert a spreadsheet into a visual format. If you have questions about what you've seen, or you'd like a more detailed explanation, or want to see your own data in here, please feel free to contact us, www.acumen.com, and I or one of my colleagues will be happy to give you more personalized demonstration.